Okay, everyone. So, I am required to have 15 minutes of class time for doing the student reviews on spot. That'll be at the end, but there's no pressure to stay and do it. You're welcome to leave early, that's fine. I'm not going to be like judging. If you do decide to do it in class, just wait till I leave. That's another thing I'm required to say. Okay, so this is the last day with new content, and it's not very much, so we'll be done early. Two clarifications I wanted to start off with. These are not testable, but just wanted to add them for the sake of my own intellectual conscience. I noticed that I misused some statistical words when I was talking about the mediation effect in one of the studies. So just so I don't cause future confusion, in a mediation, so there's the independent variable, typically the thing you manipulate. There's the dependent variable, and then the mediating variable, just put it there. If the independent variable affects the dependent variable via the mediator, that's the indirect effect. The total amount that the dependent variable affects the dv, so without doing any controlling of other variables, that's the total effect. The direct effect is the effect of the IV on the dv after controlling for the indirect effect. And what you want to happen is for the total effect to be significant, but the direct effect to not be significant. That's like the best case scenario, which means that the effect is more so driven by the effect of the IV through the mediator. So there, my conscience is now clear. And then one other thing I wanted to say, a student came up to me and was talking about this, so I decided to add this caveat. So when we were talking about the Fair and Gachter paper, there was one key theoretical issue I didn't get into, which is punishment is costly. That's one of the key problems that that paper talks about. So if you're going to be the one to go out of your way to punish someone who's free riding in the public goods game, you have to spend some of your money. And obviously that's just a situation in a lab, but in real life that's the case too. You have to go out of your way to beat somebody up for free riding on the group. And so there's a big issue in evolutionary models of punishment. How does the tendency to do that evolve? It's easy to see why you'd be upset with someone and not cooperate with them in the future. That's pretty straightforward. But why would you go out of your way to do something costly like beat them up, which is riskier? And actually the student who came up and talked to me said that they're arguing in their paper that things like punishment are more driven by cultural evolution. And that's quite plausible. For one thing, when you look at economic games like the public goods game, there's quite a bit of cultural variation in how people respond. Yeah, you can just put it there. So in some cultures, people give a lot. In some, they don't give very much. And there's also variation in punishment. How much do people, when given the chance, punish people for free riding? And even more funny than that, in some cultures, there's a phenomena called antisocial punishment, which is where if you give them the chance to use your money to take money from others, they do that to people who give, which might seem kind of strange. I won't name which country is the worst on this front, because someone else already named it Greece. But what seems to be going on is, the mindset is, look, I don't know you, you don't know me, these silly economists brought us in here to do this game. If you're being too generous, it's perceived as manipulative, and so they'll actually respond by taking money away. They'll punish niceness. So it may be that cultural psychology is a more fruitful way to think about these games than evolutionary theory. Okay, so with those two clarifications I wanted to add, we'll get into the last two readings. So the first one is from Dennett's 1995 book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, which explores the implications of evolutionary theory. And it includes kind of an aside about ethics. Actually, not all that much about evolution, but it's quite a lovely reading, and it gets into some of the issues with the two main ethical theories that we talked about, utilitarianism and deontology. And what it says for both of these systems is, they both kind of sound nice with the right kinds of philosophical arguments, but in practice they are very difficult to implement. So in the case of utilitarianism, which is about maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number, what Dennett says, and it's really hard to argue with this, there's no feasible algorithm for this. If you want to actually calculate all the consequences of any given action, it's really not possible to do that. He gives a specific example. There was a nuclear meltdown on 3 Mile Island, and you could ask, okay, for that specific action, that specific event, I should say, did it lead to more positive or negative outcomes? And there's really no way of knowing. You could say, well, maybe it'll wind up, getting us to, put more effort into safety next time. Maybe that'll counterbalance the harms that result from it. And that's kind of a silly case, but the point generalizes. It's not possible to calculate all the consequences of any given action. And the same is true for deontology. So what you're supposed to do is not look at evidence related to the consequences, but look at different possible principles or maxims and decide whether they are the kinds of principles we should endorse. There's different ways of doing this. Kant had one way of doing it. And again, there's not a clear way of rationally deciding which principles to endorse. There's all kinds of principles we could be tempted to endorse, and Dennett says there's not a clear way of deciding, at least for sure, which principles we should accept. But we can't help but make moral judgments. We have to do something. We can't just throw our hands up. We are faced with real-life moral dilemmas all the time. And he has a nice example, or a nice, parable that he wants to draw a point from. So this will be our last discussion topic of the semester. So here's the situation he concocts. Pretend you are a philosophy professor. This might be either a dream or a nightmare for, depending on who you are, but you're a philosophy professor, and your department decides to put out the following challenge. You are going to give an award to the most promising graduate student in philosophy in the country. And you throw it open, and it's a monetary prize, and you ask people to send their dossiers, so like their CV and their publications, all in a dossier. But you get 250,000 entries, and your department does not have enough people or money to fairly vet all of the entries. But you've made a contract to give money to someone, and you've said it'll be given to the most promising graduate student. How do you narrow it down? This was written in the 90s, no AI. So you and the handful of professors who are on the committee have to use old-fashioned, boring techniques to narrow it down. How do you do it? Figure something out with the people near you. Okay, so some groups have gotten more quiet. What are some strategies that we've come up with? Yeah.
You were just saying that maybe you could look at the university and see if it's a top the university, and if it's not, you just don't.
Good. So one thing you could do to, and there's pros and cons to that, but one thing you could do is narrow down. I think the paper you put there. You could narrow it down by rank of the university. You're still going to have a lot of applicants, but that's at least one way of narrowing it down. Yeah. Okay, what are some other strategies that people have? Yep.
We kind of said pull a random representative sample.
Yeah, so one way of narrowing it down is some kind of sampling method. Like, look, we're not looking at 250,000, and even if you narrow it down by school, it's still going to be a lot. Get a sample through some randomizing process. representative sample. Other strategies to make this work. Yep.
Like the citation counts, what they published and where they published, like how good the
Good. So similar to the first one, there's a way of kind of narrowing it down. So we'll only look at people with a certain number of publications or more, or people who published in top journals, something like that. So the ideas that I'm put forward are converging on what Dennett says people usually converge on. So there's some kind of procedure for narrowing it down. Maybe publication count, prestige of journals they've gotten published in, maybe length of the dossier. Like if it's too long, we can't read it fairly. If it's too short, probably not that much going on with this person. And none of these proxies are going to be perfect. They're probably going to eliminate some good candidates, but we have to narrow it down. And then out of that, maybe some kind of lottery or sampling method to, again, reduce it down to a smaller number. And then once you have it down to a manageable number, you do the normal evaluative process. Now, this is it's almost certainly not going to find the best candidate. Probably many people in that 250,000 could win in court if they said, look, mine is better than Jimmy over there who won. And they'd be right, but look, this is a good example of a real practical situation where you have to make do with what you have. So with ethics, we may not be able to prove that a given moral theory is the final ultimate truth, but we have to kind of do our best. That's all you can do. Okay, and then the last reading, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so was the punchline of that at the end? Like, there's no one moral truth?
Well, so I think that's right, but that's the punchline I would say is, even if there is a moral truth, you can't know what it is. The main moral theories out there, even if they're in some sense right, there's no way of actually calculating what all the consequences are or proving which moral principles we should endorse, so we have to just do our best. And then the last reading is the final chapter of Joshua Green's book, Moral Tribes. So it starts off with a nice, what I call a brief history of morality, so kind of the evolutionary story of how it emerges. This draws on some themes we've seen throughout the course. So you get kind of the early beginnings of morality when you get something like cooperation. This is not the normal way that species do things. Most species are basically selfish. They just, get food, copulate, and die. But sometimes you get cooperation, either through kin selection. So if two organisms are related, there can be evolutionary pressure for them to be nice to each other, or reciprocal altruism, right? Where I help you today, you help me tomorrow. However, this does not design organisms that are universally nice. They're sort of nice to the people they're related to, or the people with whom they have a cooperative alliance. So it tends to lead to a us versus them type of morality, not universal benevolence. Some cooperative species also evolve complex brains, right? Organs for guiding behavior. And even still, most brains are instinctive. They're not capable of reason or careful reflection. They are guided by instinct, or what people in the dual process tradition call System 1. But some species, especially human beings, evolved the capacity for reason, the capacity to engage in more careful thinking and planning, and the ability to reflect on one's instincts. And even though the basic logic of evolution is selfish, at least from the gene's eye view, humans and many other social species are capable of selfless behavior in some contexts, as I said, especially towards those we are related to, and those kind of in our in-group that we are cooperating with. And in order to make this work, we evolve a number of moral emotions. Moral emotions are these really handy capacities we have that kind of keep our behavior in check. They prevent the tragedy of the commons from happening. So the tragedy of the commons is these cooperative situations where what is individually beneficial is bad if everyone does it. So if everyone does the kind of selfish, rational thing, everyone is worse off. So emotions like guilt and shame or moral outrage are really useful for preventing that from happening and keeping us cooperating from those in our in-group. So in other words, this is the me versus us problem. And for that problem, our moral emotions, Green says, are very useful. But for us versus them, which Green calls the tragedy of common sense morality, our moral emotions are not so good. So our moral emotions have their origin in evolution, but different cultures can shape and modify our moral emotions in different ways. Bless you. Different cultures will have different solutions to the me versus us problem. They will have different moral norms. But in an increasingly globalized world, this can lead to disagreement, debate, both between cultures, but even within cultures. Within cultures, there will be sort of different moral teams. And as we saw in Unit 3, Green argues that for that second problem, the tragedy of common sense morality, our moral emotions and moral intuitions are not going to work. He calls this the sort of modern pasture. So you imagine multiple groups of herders that have their own solutions for cooperating, but now when they come together, there is disagreement. And so he has what he calls 6 rules for modern herders. I kind of wish he hadn't said rules, maybe the 6 suggestions. Rule is a bit intense for my liking, but in any case, 6 rules for modern herders. The first one is, in the face of moral controversy, so debate between different sets of moral intuitions, consult but do not trust your moral instincts. So he says, look, the intuitions we've been given both by evolution and by culture are very useful. He calls them, fantastic cognitive gizmos, but they are not foolproof. And if 2 people have different intuitions, and they both just say, well, my intuition is 100% right, well, that's not a promising way of resolving disagreement. Rule number 2, rights are for making are not for making arguments, they're for ending arguments. So when you appeal to a right and say, we have the right to X, that's not the kind of thing that Green thinks is decidable by reason. There's really no way of proving whether rights exist or not, or which rights exist. Which is not to say that we should never use the talk of rights. Remember in Unit 3, Green says, it's okay to appeal to rights in some cases. For example, if a moral issue has been settled and we don't want to debate it anymore, like slavery or genocide, you hold it up as a shield and say, no, these issues are just not debatable. Or you can use it as a weapon or a sword. If another group is just oppressing another group and they're not open to reason, you may use the language of rights to rally the troops. Rule number 3, focus on the facts and make others do the same. So, if you make moral issues about the facts or make them adjudicatable in terms of facts, that's a promising way to go. It's a promising way to achieve consensus. And often, moral debates do hinge on facts. So one example uses debates in the United States about healthcare, right? So both sides usually agree that people being sick and dying is bad. What the debate is about is which healthcare system is more effective. And so if you make the debate about that, then it's a matter for empirical social science, which means that the debate can be settled. Rule number 4, beware of biased fairness. So this is a term that comes up in Green's book that we didn't talk about. So biased fairness is a kind of rationalization. And I'll give an example that he gives earlier in the book that'll help you see how this plays out. Ask yourself, imagine you get sued. If the person who sues you loses, should they pay your legal fees? Show of hands, who thinks yes? Okay, less than the study. So in the study it was more, it was like 85%. When they randomly assign people to 2 conditions, in one condition people are asked, if you're sued and the person loses, should they pay your legal fees? The other group they ask, if you sue someone else and lose, should you pay their legal fees? And much fewer, less than 50%, say yes, you should. Now, I'm sure if you talk to those people, in either condition, they would say, "Oh, it's just right that they pay me, because after all, they sued me and lost. They should, cover my expenses." It's very easy to appeal to moral principles in a way that benefits you or your in-group. That's what he means by biased fairness. There's different possible principles for what counts as fair, and you often find yourself appealing to exactly the ones that benefit you. This is a point that people in the Marxist tradition often make. Now, I am not a Marxist, but that doesn't mean everything they say is wrong. When people debate economic systems, or even simple things like tax policy, they often appeal to arguments about fairness that benefit them. This is the classic, someone who's very rich says, yes, we need lower taxes because that's fair, because taxation is theft. Coincidentally, appealing to the one that happens to benefit them. Rule number 5, this one's review, use common currency. So, in the tragedy of common sense morality, when different moral teams have different sets of moral principles, we need some way of adjudicating disagreement, or common currency. So, ways in which their sets of values overlap, that's a promising place to look for ways to settle these debates. So we talked about this in the lecture on deep pragmatism. So pragmatism means focusing on what works, taking an outcome-based approach. And deep pragmatism is applying that all the way down to first principles. So what should our first principles be? Well, the ones that work, the ones that we can agree on and come to consensus with. And Green, of course, conjectures that the most promising area of overlap is happiness and suffering. He says that's the one thing we can agree on. Maybe it'll turn out there's more common ground than that, but that's maybe a plausible start, if nothing else. And then last one, rule number 6 is give. So we have the the sense, the intuitive sense, as we saw in Unit 3, that we do have a duty to save the drowning girl, but not a duty to give to life-saving charities. And it's easy to come up with different rationalizations for why that's the case, but there's at least some evidence that what's really driving the difference in responding is just physical distance. And it's very difficult to, upon reflection, endorse the idea that distance is morally relevant. And what Green says is, look, you can just try to rationalize it away, but he says the more honest thing to do is accept the kind of brutal reality of our decisions in the developed world and try to do better. You know, we know that given human nature we can't be perfect, but at least try to do a little bit better. He has this nice line that a partially successful, honest effort is better than a fully successful denial, which is a nice line. Okay, so there's one more thing I want to read from this, but before that, any questions about the final reading? Yeah.
So these are all the suggestions for modern herders,
Yes.
and that would be in any case of us versus them morality?
Yeah, us versus them morality, cases where there are moral debates. If you're within kind of your in-group and the moral intuitions and principles are working fine, well, then, you know, you can just go with that.
Moral debate.
For moral debates of the us versus them modern variety, yeah. You know, if you're having a fight with your partner, you know, probably the intuitions you have are fine. You don't need to start, you know, appealing to philosophical principles. It's probably a bad idea. Okay, so at the risk of being somewhat tacky, I'll read the final paragraph from Green's book. It's a lovely paragraph. It's a nice note to end on. Before that, one quote I have to explain. So he quotes Kant. Kant has this famous line that two things fill him with wonder, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So that's a Kant quote that he starts with. Immanuel Kant marveled at the starry heavens above and the moral law within. It's a lovely sentiment, but one that I cannot wholeheartedly share. We are marvelous in many ways, but the moral laws within us are a mixed blessing. More marvelous, to me, is our ability to question the laws written on our hearts and replace them with something better. The natural world is full of cooperation, from tiny cells to packs of wolves. But all of this teamwork, however impressive, evolved for the amoral purpose of successful competition. And yet somehow we, with our overgrown primate brains, can grasp the abstract principles behind nature's machines and make them our own. On these pastures, something new is growing under the sun. A global tribe that looks out for its members, not to gain advantage over others, but simply because it's good. Okay, that's all the content I have. We'll finish there. See you all on Friday for test review.